The air in Manhattan's Thurgood Marshall Courthouse was thick enough to choke on. It was the kind of silence that precedes an execution. On one side of the room sat a phalanx of prosecutors from the Southern District of New York, their faces grim, their suits impeccable. On the other, at the sprawling defendant's table, sat a single man, Arthur Finch, the billionaire founder of a global tech empire, now reduced to a spectacle of public ruin, and next to him, an empty chair. His lawyer, a man paid millions, had just walked out. The silence stretched, broken only by the judge's impatient cough. Then, from the back of the courtroom, a voice, calm but clear, cut through the tension. "Your Honor," it said, "I will defend him." Every head turned. Standing there, in the simple gray uniform of a courthouse janitor, was a man no one had ever noticed before. And he was about to change everything. Samuel Washington had spent 42 of his 67 years being invisible. It was a skill he'd mastered, a cloak woven from institutional disregard and the quiet dignity of a man who did his job and went home. His domain was the Thurgood Marshall United States Courthouse, a cathedral of justice where he swept the marble floors long after the titans of law had departed, their echoes of ambition and ruin clinging to the air like dust. He knew the building's secrets, the loose floorboard in courtroom 12D, the faint scent of cigar smoke that forever haunted Judge Miller's chambers, the way the late afternoon sun hit the bronze scales of justice in the main rotunda, making them look, for a moment, perfectly balanced. Tonight, however, he wasn't cleaning. He sat in the last row of the public gallery in courtroom 11A, his work uniform hidden under a worn tweed jacket, his presence as unassuming as a shadow. The case was the United States versus Arthur Finch, a legal drama that had captivated the nation. Finch, the visionary behind Finch Automata, a company that had revolutionized robotics and artificial intelligence, was accused of complex financial crimes, wire fraud, insider trading, the whole sordid orchestra of a corporate takedown. The media had painted him as a modern-day Icarus, a genius whose hubris had finally melted his wings. But Samuel knew a different Arthur Finch. Their story hadn't begun in a boardroom or a courtroom, but in the sterile, antiseptic quiet of a hospital room at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. 5 years ago, Samuel's wife, Sarah, had been losing her battle with a rare and aggressive leukemia. The doctors had been kind but firm. They were out of options. The experimental treatments were astronomically expensive, and their insurance had recoiled, sending letters filled with polite, devastating jargon. Hope had dwindled to a single, flickering ember. Samuel, a man of quiet faith and desperate action, had written a letter. Not to a god, but to a man who was rumored to play one. He'd read an article about Arthur Finch's quiet, philanthropic crusades in cutting-edge medical research. With the unsteady hand of a man clutching his last straw, Samuel wrote of Sarah, of their 40 years together, of the songs she used to hum while gardening, of the way her laughter could fill a room. He didn't ask for a handout. He asked for a chance. He sealed the letter, and using the internal courthouse mail system he knew so well, sent it to the corporate headquarters of Finch Automata, located just 10 blocks away. He expected no reply. A week later, a black car, so sleek it seemed to absorb the light around it, had pulled up to his modest home in the Bronx. Arthur Finch himself stepped out. He wasn't the titan Samuel had seen on magazine covers. He was just a man, tall and slightly stooped, with kind, tired eyes. He didn't offer platitudes or pity. He listened. For over an hour, sitting in Samuel's worn armchair, surrounded by photos of a life lived in quiet joy, Finch listened as Samuel spoke of Sarah. The next day, Sarah was transferred to a private research wing at the hospital. A team of specialists, funded by a new grant from the Finch Foundation, took over her case. Arthur visited her himself, not as a benefactor, but as a friend. He'd bring her rare books on botany, and they would talk for hours about her garden. He saw not a patient, but a person. The treatment was brutal, but it worked. The cancer went into remission. The doctors called it a miracle. Samuel called it Arthur Finch. For 5 years, their friendship had been a quiet, steady thing. Arthur never forgot a birthday or an anniversary. He'd call Samuel late at night, not for advice, but for perspective. "You spend your life cleaning up other people's messes, Samuel," he'd once said, his voice weary over the phone. "Tell me, how do you get the stains out of the soul?" Now, watching the man who had saved his world being systematically dismantled, Samuel felt a familiar, cold dread. The prosecution, led by a ruthless assistant U.S. attorney named Marcus Thorne, was painting a portrait of a monster, a greedy, soulless predator who had built his empire on deceit. Thorne was a master of narrative, weaving a story so compelling, so damning, that the facts themselves seemed secondary. The final act of betrayal came from Finch's own corner. His lead defense attorney, a legal celebrity named Julian Croft, had built his strategy on a risky plea negotiation. When the deal fell apart under Judge Wallace's unyielding scrutiny, Croft was exposed. His bluster evaporated, revealing a hollow core of self-preservation. During a heated bench conference, the whispers turned to shouts. And then, in a move of such staggering cowardice it sucked the air from the room, Croft declared a conflict of interest and petitioned to withdraw. Judge Wallace, a man whose patience was famously non-existent, granted the motion with a bang of his gavel. "Mr. Finch," he'd boomed, his voice dripping with contempt, "you have 10 minutes to find new counsel or this court will proceed with you representing yourself. The jury is waiting." Arthur Finch, the man who could bend algorithms to his will, sat stunned and utterly alone. His gaze swept across the courtroom, a silent plea for help from a world that had turned on him. His eyes met Samuel's. In that moment, there was no billionaire, no janitor. There were only 2 men, bound by a debt of life and loyalty. Samuel felt a fire ignite in his chest, a righteous anger that burned away a lifetime of invisibility. He had spent his life cleaning floors, erasing the tracks of powerful men, but he would not stand by and watch a good man be erased. He stood up, his old knees protesting, and the tweed jacket felt less like a disguise and more like armor. He took a breath, and with the weight of 42 years of silent observation behind him, he spoke the words that would shatter the cathedral of justice. "Your Honor," Samuel Washington said, his voice echoing in the sudden, absolute silence, "I will defend him." The silence in courtroom 11A was no longer passive. It was a living entity, charged with disbelief. Every eye, prosecutors, jurors, reporters, even the court stenographer whose fingers had frozen over her keys, was fixed on the old man in the tweed jacket. He stood with a quiet solidity, like an ancient tree that had weathered 1,000 storms. Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Thorne was the first to break the spell. He let out a short, incredulous laugh, a sound like tearing silk. "Your Honor," he said, turning to the bench with a smirk that was equal parts pity and contempt. "With all due respect to the gallery, this is a court of law, not a community theater. The defense is making a mockery of these proceedings." Judge Wallace, a man whose face seemed permanently set in a scowl, leaned forward, his black robes rustling. His gaze fell upon Samuel like a physical weight. "State your name for the record," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Samuel Washington, Your Honor. And your occupation, Mr. Washington?" "I'm a custodian, here, in this courthouse." Samuel's voice was even, devoid of the tremor of fear everyone expected. He had faced down death with his wife. This was nothing. Thorne's smirk widened. "A janitor. He's a janitor, Your Honor." He gestured expansively, as if presenting a punchline. Arthur Finch's life is in the hands of the man who cleans the toilets." The prosecution team chuckled, a ripple of derision that washed over the courtroom. Judge Wallace banged his gavel, the sound cracking like a whip. "Order! Mr. Thorne, your commentary is not required." He redirected his glare at Samuel. "Mr. Washington, are you a member of the New York State Bar? Or any bar for that matter?" "No, Your Honor, I am not." "Then on what conceivable grounds do you believe you can represent the defendant in a federal criminal trial?" The judge's question was a blade, meant to cut Samuel down to size, to remind him of his place. This was the moment Samuel had prepared for, not just in the frantic, sleepless nights since Arthur's indictment, but in a lifetime of study. "On the grounds of the Sixth Amendment, Your Honor," he replied, his voice ringing with a clarity that startled the room. "Specifically, as interpreted in Ferretta v. California, 422 U.S. 806. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The reporters began scribbling furiously. Even Thorne's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Samuel continued, his eyes locked on the judge. "The Supreme Court affirmed that a defendant has the right to counsel of his own choosing. While that counsel is typically a licensed attorney, the core of the right is the defendant's choice. The court cannot force counsel upon a defendant against his will. Mr. Finch is exercising his right to choose me." He turned his head slightly toward the defense table. "Arthur, do you accept me as your counsel?" Arthur Finch, who had been watching this exchange as if in a dream, slowly straightened. The fog of shock and betrayal was beginning to clear, replaced by a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. He looked at the quiet, dignified man who had stood by his wife's bedside, who had never asked for anything, and who was now risking everything. He nodded, his voice hoarse but firm. Yes, I do." Judge Wallace looked as if he'd just been forced to swallow spoiled milk. He was a man who believed in order, in precedent, in the rigid hierarchy of the legal world. A world where janitors were not seen, and certainly not heard. This was an aberration. An insult. "This is preposterous," Wallace fumed. "The defendant is facing 100 years in federal prison. He requires competent counsel, not a well-read custodian. I could hold you in contempt, Mr. Washington." "For what, Your Honor?" Samuel asked, his tone genuinely curious. "For attempting to assist a man who has been abandoned by his licensed, and I might add, exorbitantly paid, legal team? For citing established constitutional precedent? Or simply for presuming to speak in a room where men like me are expected to be silent?" The words hung in the air, a direct and devastating challenge to the authority and the prejudice of the man on the bench. Samuel wasn't just defending Arthur Finch. He was putting the court itself on trial. Thorne, seeing his narrative of a swift and brutal conviction slipping away, jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this is a clear tactic to delay and obstruct justice. Mr. Finch, having failed in his plea negotiations, is now resorting to this circus act to force a mistrial." "I am not seeking a mistrial, Mr. Thorne," Samuel said calmly, turning his attention to the prosecutor. "I am seeking a fair trial, something your office seems determined to avoid." He then turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, Mr. Finch understands the risks of pro se representation and the potential pitfalls of having a non-attorney as his advisor. He is of sound mind, and he has made his choice. The law is clear. You may not like his choice, but you are bound to respect it." The judge was trapped. Samuel had expertly cornered him with the Constitution. To deny Finch his choice now would be to open the door for an immediate and certain appeal. Wallace's face was a mask of thunder. He saw his orderly, predictable trial spiraling into chaos, hijacked by the man who waxed the floors outside his chambers. He took a deep breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his chair. "Very well," he spat, the words tasting like poison. "The court will grant a 2-day continuance, not a minute more. We will reconvene Friday morning at 9 a.m. And Mr. Washington," he added, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper, "for your sake, and for the sake of your client, you had better be prepared to do more than cite a few Supreme Court cases." He slammed his gavel down. "Court is adjourned." As the room erupted into a frenzy of frantic whispers and reporters rushing for the doors, Samuel Washington walked calmly to the defendant's table. He placed a steadying hand on Arthur Finch's shoulder. The billionaire looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and profound gratitude. "Why, Samuel?" Arthur whispered. "Why would you do this?" Samuel looked around the magnificent courtroom, at the polished wood and the towering columns, a place designed to intimidate and overwhelm. "For years, I've cleaned up the messes in this building," he said, his voice low and firm. "Today, I decided it was time to clean up the injustice." The 2 days felt like 2 minutes. Samuel and Arthur sequestered themselves in the empty, cavernous library of Finch's now vacant Upper East Side penthouse. The city lights glittered below, a galaxy of indifferent stars. The world outside was in a frenzy. News channels ran Samuel's photo alongside headlines that ranged from "The Janitor Lawyer" to "Finch's Final Desperate Gambit." Legal pundits unanimously predicted a swift and brutal slaughter. Inside, there was only the monumental task ahead. Mountains of legal documents, discovery files, and deposition transcripts covered every surface. Arthur, a genius at deciphering complex systems, was lost in the arcane labyrinth of federal law. He watched, astounded, as Samuel moved through the chaos with a quiet, methodical purpose. "How do you know all this, Samuel?" Arthur asked late on the first night, gesturing to a stack of annotated case law. "You cite precedents like a law professor." Samuel paused, holding a thick legal binder in his hands. He ran a finger over the embossed seal of the Department of Justice. "I told you I cleaned this courthouse, Arthur, but I didn't tell you everything." He began to speak, and a story unfolded that Arthur Finch, for all his insight into men and machines, had never imagined. Samuel's father, a sharecropper from Mississippi, had been a brilliant man with a mind for history and a deep, unshakable belief in the promise of the law, a promise he'd never seen fulfilled. He had been cheated out of his land by a rigged legal document he couldn't read. He spent the rest of his life urging his son to learn, to understand the levers of power that had broken him. "Don't ever let them use the words against you, son," he'd say. "You learn the words. You learn their game." Samuel had earned a full scholarship to Howard University, intending to go to law school. But in his junior year, his father fell ill. Samuel dropped out and came home to take care of his family, working any job he could find. The dream of law school faded, but the passion never did. When he eventually took the job at the courthouse, it wasn't just for the steady paycheck. It was for the access. For 42 years, the Thurgood Marshall Courthouse had been his university. He didn't just clean the courtrooms, he observed them. He listened. During breaks, he didn't sit in the staff room. He sat in the back of trials, watching the city's best lawyers at work. He learned the rhythm of a cross-examination, the art of a closing argument, the subtle dance of objections and sidebars. At night, he didn't go home and watch television. He went to the courthouse library, a place usually reserved for attorneys and clerks. The night librarians, men and women he'd known for decades, would leave the doors unlocked for him. They'd let him use the LexisNexis terminals and the vast archives. He read everything. He studied the federal rules of evidence until he knew them by heart. He devoured the biographies of legal giants: Thurgood Marshall, Clarence Darrow, Constance Baker Motley. He wasn't just a janitor, he was a scholar in shadows, a student of the very system that was designed to render him invisible. He'd earned an education more profound, more practical, than any offered at Harvard or Yale. He had learned the words. He had learned the game. "Your case, Arthur," Samuel explained, his voice low and intense. "It's not about the numbers. Thorne doesn't care about the numbers. He's a storyteller. He's telling the jury a story about a greedy billionaire. And it's a good story. It's easy to believe. But it's not true, Arthur insisted. The trades were unorthodox, yes, aggressive, but they were legal. My old lawyers. He trailed off, the bitterness fresh. Your old lawyers tried to fight his story with a different story. A story about complex financial instruments that no juror could possibly understand. They were trying to be the smartest guys in the room. But Thorne is trying to be the most relatable. And in a courtroom, relatable always wins. Samuel tapped a thick binder. We're not going to try to tell a better story. We're going to dismantle his. He began to lay out his strategy, and it was a masterpiece of simplicity and devastating logic. The prosecution's entire case rested on the testimony of one man. Kenji Tanaka, Arthur's former protege and the COO of Finch Automata. Tanaka had been the one to wear a wire for the FBI. He had provided the emails, the recordings, the entire architecture of the case in exchange for a deal that would save him from prison. He was Thorne's star witness, the hero of his story who had bravely exposed his corrupt boss. Everyone thinks Tanaka is their key, Samuel said. But he's not. He's their weakness. A story is only as strong as its narrator, and Kenji Tanaka is a liar. For the next 36 hours, they worked without sleep. Samuel guided Arthur through the labyrinth of discovery, pointing out inconsistencies Arthur's own lawyers had missed. A timeline that didn't add up. An email with a corrupted timestamp. A subtle hesitation in a deposition transcript. Samuel wasn't looking for a silver bullet. He was looking for the loose threads. He found dozens. He coached Arthur on how to speak to the jury, not as a defendant, but as a teacher. You're a visionary, Arthur. You see the world in a way others don't. Don't let them make that a crime. Explain it to them. Make them see what you see. By Friday morning, as they prepared to leave for the courthouse, the penthouse was a wasteland of coffee cups and scattered documents. Arthur felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time since his indictment, he felt he had a fighting chance. He looked at Samuel, who was carefully straightening his simple tie in the reflection of a darkened window. You should have been a lawyer, Samuel, Arthur said quietly. Samuel met his gaze in the reflection. No, he said, a faint, sad smile on his lips. I am exactly what I was supposed to be, a cleaner. Let's go make a mess. The courtroom was even more packed than before. It felt like the whole world was watching. As Samuel and Arthur took their places, a wave of whispers followed them. Marcus Thorne sat at the prosecution table, oozing a confident swagger. He looked at Samuel and gave a small, dismissive shake of his head, a gesture meant for the jury to see. He was facing a janitor. This would be a slaughter. The prosecution calls Kenji Tanaka to the stand, Thorne announced. Tanaka walked to the witness box, his face a carefully constructed mask of solemn regret. He was handsome, articulate, and dressed in a suit that screamed quiet integrity. He was the perfect narrator for Thorne's story. For 3 hours, Thorne led Tanaka through his testimony. With practiced ease, Tanaka painted a devastating picture of Arthur Finch. He spoke of secret meetings, of coded language, of a corporate culture of relentless greed. He explained complex financial transactions in simple, damning terms. He was a masterful witness, his voice filled with just the right amount of sorrow, as he described his mentor's fall from grace. By the time Thorne was finished, the jury was looking at Arthur Finch with open hostility. The story was sealed. The king was a crook. Your witness, Mr. Washington, Thorne said, sitting down with a flourish. Samuel rose slowly. He walked not to the lectern, but stood in the open space in the center of the courtroom, creating a different, more intimate connection with the witness and the jury. He held no notes. Mr. Tanaka, Samuel began, his voice soft, almost conversational. You have painted a very clear picture for us, a picture of a man you admired who betrayed your trust. That must have been very painful for you. Tanaka nodded, his expression somber. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I can imagine, Samuel said. A man's conscience can be a heavy burden. Tell me, what is the core mission of Finch Automata? Thorne stood up. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance? I'll allow it, Judge Wallace grumbled. But get to the point, Mr. Washington. The core mission, Tanaka answered smoothly, is to use technology to solve the world's most intractable problems. A noble goal, Samuel agreed. And one of those problems was global supply chain management, correct? Specifically preventing the flow of counterfeit medical supplies to developing nations. That's correct, Tanaka said, a flicker of pride in his eyes. Project Nightingale. It was one of our most important initiatives. Your initiative, in fact, wasn't it? I led the project team, yes. Samuel nodded slowly. And Finch Automata invested hundreds of millions of dollars into it, based on your projections. Projections of a revolutionary new blockchain verification system that you personally designed. Tanaka sat a little straighter. It was my life's work. And it was a complete and total failure, wasn't it, Mr. Tanaka? The question landed with a quiet thud. Tanaka's composure cracked for a second. We had some setbacks. Setbacks? Samuel's voice remained soft, but now it had an edge of steel. Let me be more specific. 6 months before you ever went to the FBI, Project Nightingale collapsed. The blockchain protocol you designed had a fatal flaw, a flaw that allowed hackers to flood the system with false data, a flaw that Finch Automata's internal auditors warned you about 3 times. Samuel took a step closer to the witness box. Isn't it true that instead of disclosing this catastrophic failure to Mr. Finch, you falsified progress reports? Isn't it true that you diverted funds from other departments to cover the mounting losses, hoping for a miracle that never came? Thorne was on his feet. Objection. Counsel is testifying. He has no evidence for these baseless accusations. Oh, but I do, Your Honor, Samuel said, turning to the defense table. Arthur slid a single, thin file across to him. Samuel opened it. I'd like to enter into evidence the internal audit reports from Finch Automata, dated June 10th, August 1st, and September 18th of last year. All 3 are addressed to Mr. Tanaka, and all 3 contain the same warning: catastrophic protocol failure imminent. The courtroom was dead silent. Tanaka's face had gone pale. Samuel continued, his voice relentless. The project was going to bankrupt the company, Mr. Tanaka, and it was all your fault. You were facing ruin, disgrace, and very likely a lawsuit from Mr. Finch that would have cost you everything. He paused, letting the words sink in. So you needed another story, didn't you? A story where you weren't the villain. A story where you were the hero. He walked back towards the center of the room. Let's talk about the trades. The so-called insider trades that form the basis of this entire case. You testified that Mr. Finch directed you to make these trades to enrich himself. But these weren't just random stock buys, were they? They were strategic acquisitions, purchases of 3 small, struggling logistics companies. They were based on non-public information, Tanaka stammered. They were based on a desperate, last-ditch effort to save your failed project. Samuel's voice rose for the first time, filled with righteous power. These companies held the patents for a different kind of verification technology, a backup plan Mr. Finch was developing without your knowledge, because he suspected you were hiding the truth from him. He wasn't trying to enrich himself. He was trying to save the company from you. He turned to the jury. The prosecution's story is that Arthur Finch is a greedy man. But look at the evidence. The money from these trades didn't go to Mr. Finch's personal account. It was all reinvested, every single penny, into a holding company, the very company that was set up to acquire these patents and salvage Project Nightingale. Samuel turned back to Tanaka, his eyes burning with intensity. You didn't go to the FBI because of your conscience, Mr. Tanaka. You went to the FBI to create a smokescreen. You framed Arthur Finch to save yourself. You took his plan to save the company and twisted it into a crime, feeding the FBI a narrative you knew they wanted to hear, another billionaire flown too close to the sun. He let the accusation hang in the air, a poison dart that had found its mark. He looked at the shattered man in the witness box. "No further questions, Your Honor." Marcus Thorne was in a state of controlled panic. His star witness had been eviscerated. The simple, elegant story he had constructed for the jury was now a tangled mess of blockchain protocols and internal audits. Samuel Washington had not played the game. He had flipped the entire board. Thorne requested a brief recess, which Judge Wallace, looking stunned, immediately granted. In the hallway, Thorne tore into his team. "How did we miss this? Internal audits? A backup plan? Tanaka swore Finch was the architect." His junior prosecutors, wide-eyed and terrified, had no answers. They had taken Tanaka's story at face value, building their case around the narrative he provided. They had been so convinced of Finch's guilt, so eager to bag a high-profile target, that they had neglected to scrutinize their own star witness. They had been outlawyered by a janitor. When court resumed, Thorne tried to repair the damage. He subjected Tanaka to a clumsy redirect examination, attempting to portray him as a whistleblower who had been outmaneuvered by a Machiavellian boss. But the magic was gone. Tanaka was no longer a hero. He was a cornered, desperate man, his credibility in tatters. Every answer sounded like a lie. The tide in the courtroom had turned. The jury, which had been looking at Arthur with contempt, now watched him with a dawning sense of sympathy, and they looked at Tanaka with suspicion. They were no longer seeing a greedy king and a brave servant. They were seeing a man betrayed and another man who would do anything to save his own skin. Samuel, however, wasn't finished. Over the next 2 days, he called a series of witnesses his predecessor had ignored. He called the low-level auditors from Finch Automata, who confirmed, in dry but damning detail, that they had repeatedly warned Tanaka about the flaws in his project. He called the heads of the 3 small logistics companies, who testified that Finch's acquisition offers had saved them from bankruptcy, and that they were now working to integrate their technology to fulfill the mission of Project Nightingale. His masterstroke was calling a woman named Dr. Eris Thorne. Marcus Thorne shot to his feet as her name was called, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "Your Honor, objection. Dr. Thorne is my sister. She has absolutely no connection to this case." Judge Wallace looked at Samuel. "Mr. Washington, explain yourself, and this had better be good." "Dr. Eris Thorne," Samuel said calmly, "is the Director of Global Health for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and for the past year, she has been in communication with the defendant, Mr. Finch, regarding Project Nightingale." The judge's eyebrows shot up. "Mr. Thorne, is this true?" Thorne was speechless. He stared at his sister, who walked to the witness stand with a look of profound disappointment on her face. He had been so blinded by his ambition, so certain of the story he was telling, that he had never once thought to ask his own sister, an expert in the very field Finch was trying to revolutionize, about the case. Dr. Thorne testified that Arthur Finch had approached the foundation not as a businessman seeking investment, but as a humanitarian. He had offered to share the technology of Project Nightingale, once it was perfected, for free, to be used in the world's most vulnerable regions. She produced a series of emails and letters from Arthur, detailing his vision for a world free of counterfeit medicine. They were passionate, brilliant, and utterly at odds with the portrait of the greedy monster her brother had painted. Mr. Finch believed, she testified, her voice clear and strong, that access to safe medicine was a fundamental human right, not a commodity. His goal was never profit. It was to save lives. The final email she read was dated just 1 week before Arthur's indictment. In it, he confessed his fears about the project's delays and his suspicions about Kenji Tanaka. "I may have put too much faith in the wrong man," he wrote, "but I will not abandon this. Too many lives are at stake. I will find another way." As his sister spoke, Marcus Thorne slowly sank into his chair, his face ashen. His own sister had just dismantled the very foundation of his case. She had destroyed his characterization of Arthur Finch, not with legal arguments, but with the simple, undeniable truth of the man's intentions. The story he had told the jury was not just wrong. It was a perversion of a noble endeavor. The silence in the courtroom was filled with his public humiliation. The hunter had become the hunted. The closing arguments were a study in contrasts. Marcus Thorne, his confidence shattered, delivered a rambling, disjointed summary of his now decimated case. He tried to reframe Tanaka as a flawed but well-intentioned man, and Finch as a manipulator who hid his greed behind a cloak of philanthropy. But his heart wasn't in it. His story had lost its power. He sounded less like a prosecutor and more like a man giving a eulogy for his own career. Then, Samuel Washington rose to speak. He didn't stand behind the lectern. He walked to the center of the room, standing on the great seal of the court embedded in the marble floor, a floor he had polished by hand 1,000 times. He was not a lawyer, and he did not try to sound like one. He was a storyteller, and he told a different story. He spoke of his father, the sharecropper from Mississippi, and the promise of the law. He spoke of his wife, Sarah, and the kindness of a stranger who had saved her life. He didn't use legal jargon or cite complex precedents. He spoke of loyalty, of betrayal, of how easy it is to believe the worst about a man when he has more than we do. For weeks in this room, you have been told a story about a greedy billionaire, he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the courtroom. He gestured towards Arthur. But the real story is not about greed. It's about a brilliant, flawed, and good man who made one mistake. He trusted the wrong person. The prosecution wants you to punish him for his success. They want you to believe that a man who has everything must have gotten it by doing something wrong. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the faces of the jurors. But I ask you to look past the story you've been told. Look at the facts. Look at the man. And ask yourselves a simple question. Is this the work of a criminal, or is this the work of a visionary who was betrayed in his quest to do something good for the world? He spoke for less than 20 minutes. When he finished, there was a profound silence. He had not only defended Arthur Finch, he had affirmed a deeper truth about justice itself, that it should not be a weapon for the ambitious or a tool of prejudice, but a shield for the innocent, no matter how powerful or powerless they may seem. The jury was out for less than an hour. The court clerk took the verdict slip, his hand trembling slightly. On the charge of wire fraud, we the jury find the defendant. He paused, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Not guilty. He continued down the list of charges: conspiracy, insider trading, obstruction of justice. One by one, the words echoed through the silent courtroom. Not guilty, not guilty, not guilty. A collective gasp went through the gallery. Arthur Finch slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, tears streaming through his fingers. Samuel placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent, steady anchor in the storm of emotion. The reporters fled the room, stampeding to break the news that would shock the world. Judge Wallace, his face an unreadable mask, officially dismissed the jury and adjourned the court. As the room began to empty, Marcus Thorne remained at his table, staring into space. His career, his ambition, his entire worldview had been shattered by the one man in the courthouse he had never bothered to see. Later, on the courthouse steps, they were mobbed by a swarm of cameras and microphones. Arthur Finch, his face still etched with the emotion of the verdict, held up a hand for silence. "I have only one thing to say," he said, his voice cracking. He turned and put his arm around Samuel Washington. This man is the finest human being I have ever known. He saved my life twice. He is not just my friend. He is my brother." The cameras flashed, capturing the image that would be on the front page of every newspaper the next day. The billionaire, exonerated and weeping, clinging to the quiet, dignified janitor who had become his savior. Samuel did not speak to the press. He did not need to. His actions had spoken with a power and an eloquence that no soundbite could ever capture. As Arthur was ushered away by his security team, Samuel slipped away from the crowd, his work done. He walked back into the silent, empty courthouse, the scene of his incredible victory. He picked up his broom and his dustpan. There were still messes to clean. The fallout from the Finch acquittal was immediate and seismic. It wasn't just a legal upset, it was a cultural moment. The story of the janitor lawyer became a global phenomenon, a modern-day David and Goliath fable that tapped into a deep public hunger for stories of justice and the subversion of expectations. For Marcus Thorne, the consequences were swift and brutal. The U.S. Attorney's Office launched an internal investigation into his handling of the case. The inquiry, spurred by public outrage and pressure from Washington, revealed a pattern of prosecutorial overreach and confirmation bias. Thorne had been so convinced of Finch's guilt that his office had engaged in what the final report called a willful blindness to exculpatory evidence. He was forced to resign in disgrace, his meteoric rise ending in a spectacular public flameout. The legal world saw it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris. Kenji Tanaka was subsequently charged with perjury, securities fraud, and obstruction of justice. Faced with the mountain of evidence Samuel had uncovered, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. In his allocution, a broken Tanaka admitted he had framed Finch to cover his own catastrophic failures. The institutional changes were even more profound. The story forced a reckoning within the legal community about class and racial bias. Law schools began using the United States versus Finch as a case study, not in financial law, but in legal ethics and the dangers of assumption. The New York State Bar Association formed a task force to study barriers to entry for non-traditional students, citing Samuel Washington as an inspiration. The phrase, "to be a Washington," entered the legal lexicon, meaning to look at a case from the ground up, to see the details everyone else overlooks. Arthur Finch, a changed man, immediately began to put his second chance to use. He fully funded and restructured Project Nightingale, putting the auditors who had originally flagged Tanaka's fraud in charge. Within a year, the system was operational, and the first shipments of verifiable, counterfeit-proof medicines began arriving in sub-Saharan Africa, saving what would soon be thousands of lives. But the biggest change was in Arthur himself. He established the Samuel Washington Endowment for Justice, a multi-billion-dollar foundation with a single radical mission: to provide funding for the legal defense of anyone who had been abandoned by the system. The endowment funded public defenders' offices, financed innocence projects, and provided scholarships for law students from underprivileged backgrounds. Samuel, however, wanted no part of the fame. He politely declined the endless interview requests, the book deals, the movie offers. He turned down Arthur's offer to make him the head of the new foundation. "That's your world, Arthur," he said one evening as they sat in the quiet of Samuel's living room in the Bronx. "My world is here." He continued to work at the courthouse. It was his home, his university, the place where he had found his purpose. But things were different now. The invisibility he had worn for 42 years was gone. Lawyers, judges, and clerks who had once looked right through him now greeted him by name, their eyes filled with a new respect. They would stop him in the halls, asking his opinion on a case, not as a novelty, but as a peer. Young public defenders would seek him out, hoping for a piece of the wisdom that had brought down Marcus Thorne. He was still Samuel Washington, the custodian. But he was also a symbol. He had not set out to change the world. He had only set out to defend a friend. But in doing so, he had reminded the world that justice is not the exclusive domain of the powerful, and that wisdom is not found only in lecture halls and law libraries. Sometimes it's found in the quiet corners, wielded by the people no one ever thinks to look at. The ripples of his single, courageous act were spreading, washing over the stone edifices of power and slowly, surely, cleaning away the stains. A year later, Samuel stood in the main rotunda of the courthouse, watching the late afternoon sun hit the bronze statue of Lady Justice. It was the end of his shift. The halls were quiet, the great battles of the day finished. He had a new title now, bestowed upon him by the courthouse staff: Chief Custodian and Legal Advisor Emeritus. It was a joke, but like all good jokes, it held a kernel of truth. A young woman approached him hesitantly. She was a new intern in the public defender's office, her face a mixture of awe and nervousness. "Mr. Washington?" she asked. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm working on my first big case. A kid from my neighborhood. They're trying to railroad him. I've read all the files and something feels wrong, but I can't see it." Samuel looked at her, and in her earnest, worried eyes, he saw a reflection of himself, all those years ago, devouring law books by moonlight. He smiled, a warm, gentle smile. "A story is only as strong as its narrator," he said softly. "Go back and look at who's telling the story. Look at what they have to gain. The truth isn't usually in the big, loud words. It's in the quiet spaces in between." The intern's eyes widened with understanding. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Mr. Washington." She hurried off, a new energy in her step. Samuel turned back to the statue. For most of his life, he had seen the scales she held as a symbol of an ideal, a promise of a perfectly balanced justice that never quite seemed to exist in the real world. But now, he saw it differently. The scales didn't balance themselves. They had to be balanced by the hands of people. People willing to step out of the shadows. People willing to speak truth to power, no matter their station. People willing to clean up the messes left by injustice. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Arthur. It was a photo of a smiling child in a clinic in Nigeria, holding a box of medicine. The caption read, "Another one saved." "Thank you, my friend." Samuel smiled. He put his phone away, picked up his bucket, and began his work. The marble floors gleamed under his practiced, steady hand. The scales of justice, for a moment, seemed to hang in perfect, luminous balance. The cleaner was still at work, and his job was far from over. In the end, the story of Samuel Washington wasn't about a janitor who became a lawyer. It was about a man who refused to be defined by his job title, who understood that true justice requires more than a law degree. It requires courage, loyalty, and an unshakable belief in the dignity of every person. He didn't just win a case, he restored faith. He proved that one quiet voice, speaking the truth, can be louder than a chorus of powerful lies. His legacy isn't written in law books, but in the lives saved by Project Nightingale, in the innocent people freed by the foundation that bears his name, and in the quiet inspiration he gave to anyone who has ever felt invisible. He reminds us all to look closer at the people around us, for you never know where you'll find a hero. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more true stories of unlikely heroes and incredible triumphs. And let us know in the comments below. Who is an unsung hero in your life?